Hey everyone, I'm doing a second presentation on Henry Ford II. Not many people knew that Henry Ford II was not Henry Ford's son. He was actually his grandson. He was born in Detroit, imagine that, in 1917. Brought up very well, wealthy, being part of the Ford family. He was accepted to Yale and was studying at Yale in 1940, 1941. And in 1941, he dropped out to join the U.S. Navy to help with World War II. And then 2 years being into the Navy, in 1943, his father passed away, and he was asked to leave the Navy to run Ford Motor Company because they believed that he was a better fit than his grandfather, the original Henry Ford, and would have a more effect on the war running Ford Motor Company than serving his country directly. So Henry Ford, the original Henry Ford, was not willing to participate in helping with the war efforts as much as the U.S. government would have liked. And that's where Henry Ford II kind of stepped up. And by 1945, he became the president of Ford Motor Company. Once he got established as president, he kind of cleaned up shop a little bit. His grandfather had some people working for him that weren't necessarily great people. One of the biggest names being Harry Bennett. He was kind of known as a Detroit bad boy, rough people up every once in a while, if that's what it came down to. After he had the old and then the bad moved out, he hired the Whiz Kids, as they were called. They were brought in from the U.S. Air Force after World War II to kind of modernize Ford Motor Company. As we've talked about before in class, the vehicles produced right after World War II were the same before the war, so Henry Ford II brought in the Whiz Kids and people that were just great minds to help modernize Ford and give them the competitive edge over GM and Chrysler. He really gave them new life. The original Henry Ford was committed to, the basics and what he always knew and thought that the Ford Motor Company could run forever on that. And Henry Ford II was able to, keep the Ford Motor Company alive and have them progress forward. He was involved with Ford until 1980. He didn't remain president that entire time, but he stayed involved in the company until 1980, and then he passed away in 1987. When he was working for Ford, his biggest failure was the Edsel, which he named after his father. Many say that it was too advanced for its time. It wasn't the country wasn't ready for the car. It was too expensive. Many things led to its failure. Now they're interesting cars because not many of them made it through. Some of his biggest successes with his time at Ford was the Thunderbird and the Mustang. Social life, he was married 3 different times. He was married from 1940 to 64, and then he remarried in 65 through 1980, and then again in 1980 he divorced and was remarried by 1987. Other than that, another interesting fact is how the Ford family's names work. Henry Ford was the founder of Ford Motor Company, and then he had a son, Edsel, and Edsel's first oldest son was Henry Ford II, and Henry Ford II's oldest son was Edsel Ford II, and Edsel Ford II's oldest son was Henry Ford III. So it's just an interesting chain that's continued on for many years, and we'll see what the generations are to come.